Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to Tactics Board, the final episode of the season as Norwich City go into their 46th game of 46 in the Championship. I think you could kindly describe it as an up and down season. Norwich currently 14th in the second tier. I think it's definitely been a dramatic one, and of course we've covered all of those ups and downs from a sort of strategic and tactical perspective on Tactics Board. A big opportunity this weekend for Jack Wilshere, his second of 2 games as the interim head coach, and a big chance for him to stake his claim to get the permanent job, because Cardiff are already relegated to League One. They've been pretty poor for most of the season, and there is an opportunity at home for Norwich to really dominate a game and to really establish themselves as a team who can create chances on the front foot, as opposed to the very good but maybe slightly more counter-attacking display they showed at Middlesbrough last week. But there were good signs in there, so there are good things going into this game, and a little bit of positivity that Wilshere and his players will try to extend going into next season. You know the drill here. First of all, I'm going to take you through my predicted 11. Then we're going to look at Cardiff, some of their strengths and weaknesses, and how the game might pan out as a result. Then we're going to expand a little bit on that sort of tactical decision that Wilshere has to make, and sort of the elements he has to show in this game, because I think he has to show to Ben Napper, who wants that possession-based dominant style of play, that he can produce that, and this feels like a really good opportunity to do that. So we'll discuss that at length in a little bit, but we're going to begin with those starting 11s. So without further ado, here's the team I think Wilshere will pick for tomorrow's game. So I've gone for Angus Gunn in goal, Rory McConville at right back, Shane Duffy and Callum Doyle in the centre of defence, with Kenny McLean at left back, Jacob Wright, Marcelino Nunez and Anis Ben Slimane in midfield, with Jack Stacey at right wing, Borja Sainz at left wing and Josh Sargent through the middle up front. You'll notice no changes there from that Middlesbrough game, and although I think the tactics will have to be quite different, I think that's what Wilshere will go for, just because it worked against Middlesbrough, a team who obviously are pushing for the playoffs still. We're in quite a good position to make them until that draw, and I think everyone could see the improvements that were made in that game compared to recent weeks where Norwich have looked a bit stale. To be honest, they haven't looked that motivated, they haven't looked that hungry or energetic, and they did have all of those elements against Middlesbrough. As I said, there weren't those sort of in-possession elements that I think Ben Napper will want to see from Jack Wilshere in order to give him the job permanently, but I think there were plenty of good things that fans took away from that. Obviously only 700 in that away end, and I think Wilshere will want to show the same things to those fans. You know, there should be 25,000 there this weekend, so I think there's an opportunity there for him to do that. Obviously you could say that team wasn't necessarily geared to create loads of chances in a possession-based system, but there are a couple of reasons why I think he'll keep it the same. One of them is that Cardiff are quite good in wide areas. Of course, we'll come on to that in a minute, but having Jack Stacey and Rory McConville both on that side, I think will help with that defensively. Obviously, when Middlesbrough attacked, Norwich were in more of a 5, not necessarily quite to that extent, but McConville tucked in a lot more and Stacey was a lot deeper. Whereas in Torup's system, you had actually the right winger pressing the other centre-back. So Josh Sargent would press one centre-back, the winger would press the other centre-back, and then the midfielder would go wide. It was actually Josh Sargent pressing one centre-back, usually Marcelino Nunez or Anis Ben Slimane pressing the other centre-back, and Stacey staying quite deep and marking the fullbacks who were playing very high for Middlesbrough. That worked quite well, and you'd think that with the wing-backs that Cardiff use, the pace that they've got and how attacking they can play at times, that system might work. Although, of course, Cardiff do have the ability to go to a back 5 and use 3 centre-backs in that area. So if Norwich are only having Sargent and one midfielder pressing, then they will be outnumbered in that sense. But of course, there is also scope to have Sargent pressing the middle centre-back, Slimane pressing the right centre-back for Cardiff, and Nunez pressing the left centre-back. So there will need to be sort of subtle adjustments made to that, but I thought that was one positive from the first game that Wilshere took charge of. I think that pressing system made just a little bit more sense and required less reshuffling to the in-possession system. And I think having Jack Stacey out there does help with that. So that would make sense to me, especially given how good he was in that game last week, ran up and down throughout it and actually produced quite a lot of quality. So I think Stacey out there would be another positive sign. Of course, not many options to choose from. It could be that Ante Cianat is ready to play a role, but it's been a few weeks since he last featured, which was in that 2-1 defeat actually by Plymouth, I think, when he had that ankle issue. So it would be quite a stretch to chuck him in straight from the start, although we know that Jack Wilshere does rate him very highly. So I think partly because of the lack of options, partly because of how well it works with their press, and also partly because of how good Stacey was technically as a winger last week, I think it makes sense for him to keep things like that. Of course, there is an argument again with sort of Callum Doyle that maybe you should have Jose Cordoba in there because he's going to be at the club next season. But I think last week showed that Wilshere is now thinking, as much as on a long-term basis, on a short-term basis, to prove his credentials in these 2 games and to get fans up for next season. So that's the team I think he'll go for. Of course, there is a bit of scope for change just because it's now a home game against a team you're expected to beat rather than an away game, which I think Norwich were expected to lose. But if it isn't broken, then why fix it? And that might be the logic that Wilshere uses going into this one. On to Cardiff, and as I mentioned, they've got a lot of strength in the wide areas. They carry a threat there, and actually some of their best players are in those fullback, wing-back positions. As I mentioned, they can go between a back 4 and a back 5. They have tended toward a back 4 under Aaron Ramsey since Omar Reza lost his job, and well, basically since I think they looked like they were likely to be relegated. But that was confirmed last week with a 0-0 home draw against West Brom, which in isolation wasn't a bad result. But I think it highlighted some of the problems they've had this season. Not necessarily the most offensively effective. Obviously, they did the job against Norwich earlier on in the season. But I think a lot of their chances do come from those wide areas. And if they can get the likes of Callum O'Dowda and Perry and G, who are 2 of their better players, into advanced positions and trying to create chances. Of course, O'Dowda scored the winner when Cardiff produced that injury time comeback at home against Norwich. And I think that's why, or obviously that's an example of why you need somebody like Stacey who will do that tracking back, somebody like Rory McConville, who obviously is a centre-back by trade and does have those sort of defensive attributes to stop the wingers coming forward. I think in possession, you want McConville on the ball a little bit further inside, but when it comes to out of it, I think having Stacey and McConville out there to stop O'Dowda will really help. There will need to be that work rate again from Borja Sainz, which of course Kenny McLean helps. I think he's got a little bit more athleticism than Callum Doyle out there, and certainly the work ethic that you need to play that role. I thought Sainz actually was better at the defensive side, at the pressing side, at keeping running throughout that game against Middlesbrough. So if he can reproduce that, then Norwich should be able to nullify the wide areas. But really, what they should be doing is focusing on themselves and how they can impose themselves on the game, because Cardiff are likely to come and sit in and try to make things hard for Norwich, of course, in the same way that Norwich's season is basically over as far as motivation for what they can achieve in the table. Cardiff will have away fans who have travelled a long way to see this game, and they'll want to send them into the League One season with a little bit of optimism. I think it's going to be hard to really make that fan base feel particularly positive, but they will be among the favourites to win the 3rd division next season, and they will have that motivation to make everyone feel like that's possible really in this game. So I think they'll be defending quite deep to try and get a result from this, and Norwich will have a different task on their hands to what they had against Middlesbrough. They'll have to create chances against a defence that sat deep, and they didn't really do that much. They didn't have much practice against Middlesbrough, to be honest. Much of it was both teams trying to press each other, a little bit of a basketball game at its best, and the space for Norwich to pass the ball through the thirds. I think they do have some of the quality to unlock defences. Obviously, Marcelino Nunez in that midfield can produce a little bit of magic. Jacob Wright is a very good passer, but they still don't have that sort of number 10 type. So if Emiliano Marcondes can come back fitness-wise, of course, they've extended his contract, so he'll be around next season. I think if he could come on as a substitute and try to create a bit of chaos in that number 10 position, then that could really help Norwich force things through those lines. But I think much of it is on Wilshere as a coach, because obviously he's only had a week to build into this game, and he's got to now create patterns of play that will help Norwich get through defence, because I don't think they have enough individual quality like an Emi Buendia or a Wes Hoolahan to just take the ball on and make things happen and beat a couple of players and nutmeg somebody and find Josh Sargent through on goal. So I think there will need to be signs of that high quality pattern of play, and Wilshere will of course be responsible for producing those. So in terms of how dominant they can be in possession and how much they can create those chances, I think a lot of it comes down to him. Also, it's about pressing and keeping the ball high up in the Cardiff third. If every time they lose it, they're lax and Cardiff can take a bit of possession, can slow things down, can get the ball forward, then that is a problem for Norwich. You want them winning the ball back quickly in the first 3 to 5 seconds after they've lost it, really, so that they can keep Cardiff hemmed in, so that they can spend more time in dangerous areas and ultimately test the Cardiff defence more times. So I think the pressing is a big part of it, the patterns of play are big parts of it, and how well Wilshere does at that, I think will be a big factor really as to whether he gets the job permanently. So although there's not much to enjoy and to create intrigue in terms of what Norwich can achieve this season, I think around Wilshere's future and that vacant permanent head coach position, it is quite an interesting one. And of course, we'll have every kick covered across Pinken channels, so go to pinken.com/subscribe if you haven't already, and you'll have access to all of our content. Thank you very much for joining me on Tactics Board. I'll see you next season.